The Code of Personal Status is a series of progressive Tunisian laws aiming at the institution of equality between women and men in a number of areas. It was promulgated by beylical decree on August 13, 1956 and came into effect on January 1, 1957. This code is one of the best-known deeds of Habib Bourguiba, who was prime minister and later president. He gave women unique place in Tunisian society, notably abolishing polygamy, creating a judicial procedure for divorce and requiring marriage to be performed only in the event of the mutual consent of both parties. Bourguiba's successor, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, did not challenge the code and himself introduced modifications that reinforced it, in particular with the July 1993 amendment. Historical context. The feminist question is a recurring theme in Tunisia, more than in all the other countries of the Maghreb, and the country is from that point of view atypical of the region. It seems to affirm a distinctiveness which it has followed since the beylical period which, on the eve of the institution of the French protectorate, was going to engage in a process of reforms establishing its connection to society in a modern national perspective. As early as 1868, Hayreddin Pasha wrote, "The surest way to an understanding of the state of nations in Arabic." This explained that the future of Islamic civilization depends on its modernization. In 1897, Sheikh Mohammed Snorsi published The Flowers Blooming, or a Study of Woman in Islam, in which he advocated the education of girls. 15 years later, Abdelaziz Thalbi, Cesar Benatta and Hadi Sabai published The Koran's Liberal Spirit, which urges the education of girls and the removal of the veil. In 1930, Taha Haddad, himself influenced by the reformist current begun in the 19th century by Khaireddin Pasha, Ibn Ahmad ibn Abidiyah, Mohammed Snorsi, Salim Boujeb, Mohammed Bayramvi and other thinkers who all defended the concept of modernism, published Our Women in Sharia and Society. Quote, "He demonstrated the possibility of compatibility between Islam and modernity. The arguments he presented were subsequently adopted by Bourguiba in his speeches." Radia Haddad wrote in her autobiography, Woman's Talk, "On the eve of independence, the most ancient and the most blatant injustice was the condition of women." Although Haddad's proposals were condemned in his time by conservatives, nearly all of his proposals were included in the drawing up of the code, including obligatory consent for marriage, the establishment of a procedure for divorce and the abolishment of polygamy. The failure of Haddad to bring into effect his wishes while alive is registered in Habib Bourguiba's later success. He occupies an important place in the history of social and political ideas in Tunisia. In the same period, Sheikh Mohammed Fathel Ben Akawa, who was Mufti of Tunisia and rector of the University of areas.It, issued a fatwa, result of a personal ijtihad. At the same time, the reformist newspaper Ennahda published the poems of Abul Qasim Chabi, who participated to a lesser extent than Haddad in the defense of the rights of women. In 1947, Mohammed Abdul Aziz Jade, former justice minister who was later opposed to the code and author of a majella codifying personal status and estate law, undertook an initial and timid effort to harmonize the doctrines of the Maliki and the Hanafi majority in Tunisia, that ultimately had no result. In November 1940, Mohammed Zarouk founded the first francophone feminist magazine, Layla, which however ceased publication in July 1941. but whose name was taken up symbolically by Bashir Ben Ahmed, who, on May 23, 1955, started a magazine, Layla Speaks to You, later Feminine Action, in the 5th issue of his weekly Action. Lacking women absent from Tunisian press of the period, the magazine folded, but Ben Ahmed had made the acquaintance of Dora Boussard, then a student in Paris, and recruited her to relaunch the magazine. On June 13, 1955, Boussard, then the magazine's only woman, edited in its 8th issue an article signed with the pseudonym of Layla and entitled Call for Emancipation Law. On the occasion of the promulgation of the code, she wrote on September 3, 1956, in a special double page of the 56th issue an article titled Tunisian Women Are Adults, with an editorial recalling the collaboration in its production of the two sheikhs Mohammed Abdul Aziz Jait and Mohammed Fadl Ben Akawa. In 1959, Safia Farhat and Boussard co-founded the magazine Pfizer, which, although it ceased publication in December 1969, remained famous in the Maghreb and more generally in Africa, as the first Arab-African feminine francophone magazine. Text: the Code instituted for the first time in an Arab Muslim country the principle of the consent of the two spouses as a requirement for the validity of all marriages. Furthermore, it instituted an obligatory minimum age for marriages, fixed first at 18 years for men and 15 years for women. The precise text that, below this age marriage cannot be contracted, except by the special authorization of a judge who may not grant it, except for serious reasons and in the well-understood interests of both spouses. In this same case, consent for the marriage of a minor must be given by the closest parent, who must fulfill three conditions, namely being of sound mind, adult and masculine. The code also forbade the marriage of a man with his ancestors and descendants, with his sisters and the descendants to infinity of his sisters and brothers, with his aunts, great-aunts and great-great-aunts, and with the woman whom he has divorced 3 times. Polygamy, although rather marginal in the period, is likewise forbidden, even if the second union is not formal. Quote, "Whosoever being engaged in the bonds of matrimony shall contract another before the dissolution of the preceding shall be liable to a year's imprisonment and to a fine." Bourguiba referred to a surah of the Quran to justify this measure. "We have abided by the spirit of the Holy Book, which indicates monogamy. Our decision in the matter contradicts no religious text and is found to be in agreement with mercy and justice and the equality of the sexes." This surah states that it is permitted to marry 2, 3 or 4 among the women who please you, but if you fear not being just towards them, then only 1, or some slaves that you possess. This to the end of not committing injustice. For Bourguiba, the condition of equality between spouses being impossible to assure, prohibition of polygamy became therefore legitimate, and, provoking conservatives, he added, the defenders of polygamy would have to admit in a spirit of equality that the wife be polyandrous in the event of the husband's sterility. The code also prescribes that each of the 2 spouses must treat the partner with kindness, live in good rapport and avoid all prejudice, thus abolishing the wife's obligation of obedience to her husband. At the same time, the text obliged the wife who was in possession of goods to contribute to the family's expenses, so that the husband not have powers of administration over the wife's possessions. Until 1956, divorce remained the prerogative of the man, who could unilaterally repudiate his partner by a simple declaration before 2 witnesses. The code, to the contrary, instituted a divorce procedure that could not take place except before a court which decided the dissolution of the marriage. Quote, This same court did not rule except in a case brought through the mutual consent of both spouses and in the case of the request of one of the partners as the result of harm of which that spouse was the victim. It is also stated that material harm would be recompensed in the form of a monthly alimony payment, to the level of life to which she was accustomed during married life, here including residence. Once more, Bourguiba justified himself by the decree of the Quran. The code also instituted the principle of the equality of men and women in relation to citizenship. Moreover, if a child did not possess his own goods, the necessary costs of his upbringing were predicated on those of the father. Successive reforms. Habib Bourguiba's policy. Previous political action. Taking the lead in Tunisia's modernization campaign, Habib Bourguiba in each of his speeches found occasion to criticize sexist attitudes, opposing the hijab and appealing to science on the issue of virginity at marriage. Tunisian women, hearing his call, unveiled and often asked him to settle disputes with their husbands. His ruling always inclined in favor of women and made him all through the long decade of the 60s the tireless defender. It is necessary to know that Bourguiba always worshipped his mother, who died prematurely, according to the chief of state, in 1913. In several of his speeches, memory of her returned, and the exhaustion born of the double function of the spouse and the mother contributed to his denunciation of the feminine condition in traditional Tunisian society. Although his declaration can be considered sincere, other expositions indeed demonstrate a certain hostility to the period's domestic tradition. It is to be recalled that his mother's memory played no fundamental role in his political positions concerning the feminine condition during the French protectorate. In this context, on the eve of independence, there did not really exist a political movement strictly based on the demand for the rights of women. Existing institutions sustained political parties, and although these rights were the subject of speeches, they were not then among political priorities. The Union of Women and the Union of Girls belonging to the Communist Party agitated especially in the social and labor domains. As for the Muslim Union and the Cells d'Estourian women created in 1951–1952, they did not begin to call for the right to vote and eligibility for office until 1955. These two rights became official on March 14, 1957, and Tunisian women voted for the first time in municipal elections in May 1959 and later in the presidential and legislative elections of November 1959. But the right to education remained the only one unanimously sought by feminine organizations. For this point of view, the code was not promulgated under any feminist pressure that, when it existed, was usually directed to other ideals. Pursuit of reforms. On August 10, 1956, Prime Minister Bourguiba devoted an entire speech to the code, which was to be promulgated 3 days later. He described it as a radical reform which would make marriage a state matter, an act that must be supervised by public law and society in its entirety. Drafted by 15 jurists, the majority Arabic speakers, under the supervision of the Justice Minister, Ahmed Mestiri. The code was voted in the wake of independence and even before the drafting of the Constitution. Assembled in 12 books, it gave to women a unique status in the Arab-Muslim world. Proclaimed on March 20, 1956, then promulgated on August 13 of the same year by Lamin Bey's beylical decree. The code came into force on January 1, 1957. This act registered a series of reforms touching other aspects of the impact of religion on society. Thus, on May 31, public charitable foundations were suppressed, as private ones would be on July 1, 1957. On August 3, secular courts replaced religious courts as the High Court for the application of Islamic law, while the law of September 27, 1957 closed the Rabbinical Court of Tunis. The members were integrated into the body of common law magistrates. On January 10, 1957, the wearing of the veil at school was forbidden. According to the decrees of March 29, 1956 and October 1, 1958, Zaytuna University was closed, as were the other madrasas, the official goal being to progressively suppress all previous types of teaching, unadapted, hybrid or outdated. However, more than this modernization concern, there existed as well the need to destabilize an important source of political opposition based on religion. In the years following independence, women obtained the right to work, to move, to open bank accounts and to establish businesses without the permission of the husbands being sought. July 1, 1965 saw a law allowing abortion as much for social as for therapeutic reasons. Women had been encouraged to limit the number of the children since the beginning of the 60s, and the contraceptive pill was rendered freely accessible throughout the country, annulling thereby the French law that in 1920 outlawed all means of contraception. A law of March 1958 imposed civil marriage, and on December 14, 1960, another law limited to 4 the number of children benefiting from family allowances. Bourguiba founded the Union of Tunisian Women in 1956, entrusting to it leadership in favorable publicity for his feminist policy. During a speech delivered on December 26, 1962, Bourguiba stated, "Work contributes to the emancipation of women. By her work a woman or a girl assures her existence and becomes conscious of her dignity." In practice, on September 14, 1965, Tunisia ratified the International Labour Organization's Convention No. 111 concerning discrimination in the matter of employment and profession. Later, in 1968, ratification of the ILO's Convention No. 100 instituted equality of treatment in employment of men and women for work of equal value. These measures added to co-education in schools and, as a consequence, the entry of more and more young women into the workplace, involving the decline of marriage and of births, of which the target was 46% in 1966 and 30% in 1971. Mohamed Barakat and Dominic Tabutin estimate that 2/3 of the reduction in births during the period 1966 to 1975 is the demographic consequences of these measures. In 1980, Tunisia's level of demographic growth was among the lowest in the southern countries and is found to be the lowest of the Arab world. This rate was 2.2 children per woman in 1998 and 1.73 children in 2007. Radia Haddad recognizes Bourguiba's merits in these transformations. If all countries have finished, one day or the other, in freeing themselves from foreign invaders, none, and surely no Arab Muslim country, has dared a social revolution to such an extent. The Code and Religion. This series of reforms, although it fell short of the customary norm, which can be illustrated by the introductory adoption in 1958 unknown in Muslim lands and from the full adoption in 1959, never breaks with religion. Bourguiba is declared to be a mujtahid and not a Kemalist because he reproached the Turkist leader as too removed from society. Since 1956, all responsible authorities, notably the Minister of Justice, Ahmed Mestiri, and the different directors of UNFD, recalled on many occasions that the code and successive laws were not opposed to Islam, but registered in the context of a reform of society inside Islam. Furthermore, each of the measures taken in drawing up the code was accompanied by justification provided from a liberal interpretation of Muslim Muslim law. During a speech delivered in Tunis on February 8, 1961, Bourguiba expressed his opinion on reason's domination above all other means of thought. There are still people who do not conceive that reason must apply to all things in this world and command all human activity. For these people, certain domains, that of religion in particular, must escape the ascendancy of the intelligence. But then, in behaving this way, one destroys at one blow the fervor and veneration that we all owe to the sacred. How admit this ostracism against reason? How abase ourselves to this functioning of an intelligent animal? Nevertheless, we are forced to testify that Bourguiba's Tunisia could no more be called secular than Ben Ali's of the rest of the Arab Muslim states, for more than a neutrality of orientation and the religious freedom of the state. Secularism implies the autonomy of public and religious institutions. The reality is that the institutional presence of Islam in Tunisia, although strictly circumscribed, is truly a constant reference, implicit or explicit, legitimizing the regime's direction. Certainly, Tunisian public services are accessible to all without distinction of creed, and the constitution guarantees religious freedom, so long as it does not threaten public order. But Islam remains the state religion, to the extent that it is said it is obligatory for the President of the Republic to be able to assert it. Conservative reaction. In this context, presidential feminism remains ambiguous, as is illustrated by the speech delivered during the UNFD's Third Congress, held between December 20 to 29, 1962, in which he declared that he had to protect the family and guarantee to man the faculty of being its head. The policy of Bourguiba lost its vitality in the 1970s. This absence of new reforms can be explained in different ways. The deterioration of the president's health, the delayed reaction of conservatives remaining reserved in the course of preceding decades, and the resistance of society shaken to its foundations. At the same time, power desired the destabilization of the Marxist left and encouraged the founding of the Association for the Preservation of the Quran in January 1968, which contributed to the birth of the Islamist party Ennahda. Also, the silence of the code concerning marriage between a Muslim woman and a non-Muslim man since 1969 is interpreted by most judges as a recognition of the prohibition decreed by Muslim law in the matter. This reasoning was approved on November 5, 1973 by a circular of the Minister of Justice, who, to stay away from the negative sides of the West, prohibited marriages between Muslims and non-Muslims, and who judged void marriages in which the non-Muslim husband had not converted to Islam and where a certificate of conversion was not provided. Courts during this period often interpreted the code in a restrictive manner, refusing, for example, all right of inheritance for non-Muslim women in religiously mixed marriages. Bourguiba himself yielded to the conservatives' wishes and in 1974 refused the pressure of his entourage and a majority of his government wanting to modify the law concerning equality in succession, which had instituted the equality of the sexes in relation to inheritance. Indeed, on this issue he could not refer to the Quran to justify himself, as the text is clear: "Two sons, a part equal to that of two daughters." Quote, in 1976, at the UNFD's Sixth Congress, he openly declared that it is not necessarily that women exercise remunerative activities outside her home. He seems to renounce one of the principles of his modernization policy. The 1980s are characterized in the same line through an immobility in terms of feminist reforms, with the exception of some advances not negotiable at the beginning of the decade. Law No. 81-7 of February 18, 1981, entrusting to the widow mother the upbringing of minor children and favoring women in divorce cases. Moreover, on November 1, 1983, Bourguiba named 2 women ministers, Fathia Mzali to the Ministry of the Family and of the Advancement of Women and Suad Ubi to Public Health Policy of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. At the end of 1987, Zine El Abidine inherited a society shared between conservatives who urged modification of the code in a regressive sense, and modernists who wished its continuance to symbolize Tunisia's anchorage in modernity. The new president provided proof of an extreme prudence, seeing that this is the connection that a good part of public opinion based itself in forming its judgment on the new president. During his first months in power, he put into place interruptions of television and radio broadcasts to broadcast the call to the 5 daily prayers and reopened Zitouma University, all while criticizing Bourguiba's secular drift, and while glorifying Tunisia's Arab-Islamic identity. At the beginning of March 1988, the Daily Sabah announced that an amendment of the code aiming at the prohibition of the adoption of children was under consideration, and this provoked the reaction of 40 academics of all political orientations who circulated a petition calling for the necessary separation of Islam and politics. On the morrow, March 19, Ben Ali, during a televised address, publicly asserted his support for the code. There will be no challenge and no abandonment of that which Tunisia realized to the benefit of women and the family. Nevertheless, the feminine condition was not then among his priorities, and one finds in his actions the same political ambiguity as that which existed with Bourguiba. Prize to conscience. It was not until leaving 1989, once that the connection with Islamists was broken, that a new modernist discourse took its place. Women were then called upon to characterize this change. Official receptions have been mixed since 1992, and ministers and senior civil servants were encouraged to attend accompanied by the spouses. The new First Lady, Leila Ben Ali, made more and more public appearances, and as a spokesperson for her husband, gave regular speeches on the role of women in the country. Putting this change into practice could equally be illustrated by the creation in 1991 of the Center for Research, Studies, Documentation and Information on Women, and setting up at the ministerial level a National Commission, Women and Development, charged with studying the role of women in development in the context of the preparation for the 8th Economic Plan. In 1991, a law made compulsory the education of all children. On August 13, 1992, on the occasion of National Women's Day, Ben Ali gave a speech renewing Bourguiba's modernism, in which he stated, "The rehabilitation of woman, the recognition of her gains and the consecration of her rights in the context of religious values to which our people are proud to adhere." The reference to Islam become almost ritual, even if there was also added the memory of the ancient Carthaginian past of the country in insisting on its cultural diversity, becomes more subdued by referring to speeches given between 1987 and 1989. Returning to this speech, 3 major ideas dominate: praise of achieved and irreversible modernity, recognition of known societal advances, such as the passing of the extended family for the nuclear family, and the necessity to put into practice the advances in legal texts, declaring that he was convinced of the aptitude of women to assume the highest duties in the heart of the state and society. He announced the creation of a state secretariat charged with women and the family, and the nomination of a number of superior women to cabinet. He recognized on this occasion that the equality of the sexes did not yet fully exist and foresaw future improvements. We reaffirm here our support for these achievements and our determination to protect them and to enhance them.